Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Thank you to Todd for being my advisor and to Brett and Kathy for also being on my committee. So for my thesis research, I did a qualitative study on how Wisconsin extension educators talk about climate change with the communities they serve around the state. So I'll start with some background on climate change communication. Climate change is of course a very complex and controversial issue, which means that people make sense of it through mental models, these kind of simplified frameworks for how the world works. And facts are one part of people's mental models, but they're not the whole story. People's identities matter a lot. With climate change, one's partisan affiliation is unfortunately the top demographic predictor of whether they think human-caused climate change is happening, as well as a variety of other attitudes. And the terms we use to refer to climate change can get wrapped up in those political identities as well. So for example, Republicans may be more willing to engage in both collective and personal behaviors, as well as support pro-climate policies when they're phrased in terms of extreme weather than if it's in terms of climate change. People's values matter a lot as well when communicating about climate change because it's an issue that touches every aspect of society. We can talk about it as an environmental issue, or an economic problem, or a public health issue, or a national security threat. And these are all called emphasis frames. And the frame that resonates most with someone is going to depend on what they value. And lastly, experiences shape our mental models, but also our mental models shape how we interpret our experiences. So for example, a lot of farmers are resistant to the idea of human-caused climate change, but they see the changes happening to them. They see the droughts and the extreme rainfall, and they're actively striving to adapt, even if they're not talking about it as human-caused climate change. So why does extension matter for climate change communication? Well, as I think all of you here know, Extension is the outreach arm of land-grant universities, and they've been doing on-the-ground public engagement work for more than a century. And in almost every county across the country, the system has about 32,000 employees total, so it's quite expansive. And a lot of extension work happens in rural communities, which experience climate change differently than urban communities do. And so it's really important to take them into consideration when thinking about how we respond to climate change. Also, extension is very highly trusted among most of its audiences. For example, among agricultural advisors, extension is the most highly trusted source of information about climate change. And there's a lot of research showing that interpersonal conversations can shift climate attitudes and spur action. And so extension is really well positioned to be having those dialogues with communities across the country. So when you ask extension professionals what they think about climate change, there's kind of mixed beliefs about its causes and overall attitudes, just like among the general population. But there are some pretty consistent attitudes in terms of how extension should handle climate change. If you ask, should extension incorporate climate change into its programming, the answer is an overwhelming yes. Do you already incorporate climate change into what you do? That tends to be a bit more of a mixed bag, with some professionals saying yes, but a lot of extension educators, typically more than half, saying no, they don't currently. And if you ask, do you feel prepared to talk about climate change, most extension professionals will say no. And these results have been pretty consistent across at least 5 different states that have done this sort of needs assessment. So for my research, I wanted to look at not just needs for the future, but also current practice. How do extension educators currently approach climate change communication? So I did a qualitative comparative case study looking at 3 different Wisconsin extension programs. Crops and Soils works with farmers as well as industry and agency partners, and they're trying to guide farming practices for profitability and sustainability. Community Economic Development works with businesses, nonprofits, local government agencies, and a variety of stakeholders to improve the economic well-being and quality of life of Wisconsin communities. And then Financial Education works with low-income people, people impacted by systemic racism, as well as renters and older adults, to try to support individuals and families' financial well-being. I did in-depth semi-structured interviews with 4 educators from Crops and Soils, 7 from Community Economic Development, and 4 from Financial Education. I also talked with the program manager from each of these 3 areas as a way of getting another perspective on the topic. So the educators I spoke with cover a wide range of urban and rural communities all over the state, and they have between 6 months and 31 years of experience with Wisconsin Extension. My first research question was, how do educators think about climate change in relation to their work? This sets the backdrop, provides important context for understanding how they talk about climate change. And I found a wide range of connections with climate change. On one side of things, the people in crops and soils told me, I feel like it's behind the scenes of everything that I'm doing. On the other end of the spectrum, the sentiment in financial education was, I don't feel like the topic of climate change is really impacting what I'm doing. And then community economic development educators spanned that whole spectrum, with one person telling me it's 100% related to what they do, another one saying it's peripheral. But as I was having these conversations, I found that even those who don't perceive many connections actually do talk about climate-related topics with constituents. And so that was the bulk of what I wanted to understand. How do educators approach talking about climate change with clients? I found three main themes that showed up in all three program areas, but the details did play out differently between the three programs. So the first big theme was going in the back door. Outside of Dane County, educators are mostly not using the phrase climate change. One educator said that that phrase in their community is just as polarizing as the phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the words are what they object to, not necessarily to the activities that are being done under those words. And so educators have found more success using phrases like climate variability, changing weather patterns, extreme weather, or even in some cases, changing climate. So that's how they're approaching the umbrella concept. But more often than that, educators are going in the back door by talking about specific, local, and relatable issues that their clients are facing. So that could be soil health. That could be the possible tourism revenue from installing electric vehicle chargers. That could be saving money on energy bills by improving energy efficiency within the home. And the way educators talk about these topics are really tailored to constituents' mental models. So here's an example of that came from both community economic development and financial education. One major climate impact in the state has been a decrease in snowfall in northern Wisconsin. And that's a problem because snowmobiling and skiing and winter recreation in general are a big part of the culture and economy in that region of the state. And so that's meant less income for seasonal workers. And so some of my interviewees are helping constituents deal with that problem by applying for grants and emergency loans. Here's what one educator told me. Focusing on it from an economic perspective is the safest way to engage with people. Saying the amount of carbon that we release is what's causing the lack of snowfall is probably not going to start a fruitful discussion. And that type of economic framing was the most common type of framing I heard in all three programs. But again, they weren't framing all of climate change as an economic problem. It was whatever specific climate-related issue they were talking about, they were framing as an economic problem. You also might notice about this example that it's more about adapting to the impacts of climate change, adjusting how we live based on how the climate is changing. It's not about mitigating climate change or reducing greenhouse gas emissions in any way. And that was the second big theme, is that mostly educators are focusing on resilience. And that term, resilience, was used a lot, especially in crops and soils, more than the term adaptation was. Educators told me that their clients are just thinking about making ends meet on a day-to-day basis, and the topic of climate change as this big global issue feels unapproachable to clients. And so adaptation has to be first, because if you can get them to understand how this is going to affect them, you'll get more buy-in. And if you can give them some solutions on how to protect themselves and how to stabilize their own lives, they'll have more energy and willingness to get into the mitigation. So this ties in with the social science concept of efficacy, which is your internal sense that you can take actions and those actions you take will make a difference. And so by focusing on resilience, educators are really helping to foster that sense of efficacy. Now I will say that there was one community economic development educator and one crops and soils educator who do talk about mitigation a lot in certain contexts, but in general, educators were much more focusing on resilience. The last big theme was showing empathy. This came up more often in community economic development and financial education than it did in crops and soils. And educators talked about listening actively to constituents, asking thoughtful, non-judgmental questions, and also demonstrating to their constituents that they are similar to them. One example of that came from an educator who talked about bringing an extension specialist from Madison to their community, and they talked about climate change in maybe a more direct way than the educator would have. So here's how they handled that. I can say, the specialist is coming from a different perspective of things, but maybe there is some truth to what she's saying. We can continue the conversation, and maybe there's aspects of it that weren't considered before that we could now talk about. And I can be seen as not the radicalist, but the partner, or part of the same group as those that I'm talking with. So all in all, educators do have some effective strategies for talking about climate change. That doesn't mean they have it all figured out. In particular, I did hear in a lot of cases a lack of overarching strategy for how they're addressing these issues, which means that mitigation isn't being addressed as effectively as it could be potentially. And so the last part of what I wanted to understand then was what uncertainties and challenges do educators face about climate change and climate change communication, and what resources do they want? So I'm going to come back to this in my recommendations for extension, but for now I want to focus on one aspect in particular, which is over and over I heard a need for locally specific climate information tailored to each program area. So in crops and soils, educators are interested in weather data and impacts on specific crops. In community economic development, one educator asked for ways that their community can take action and get plugged into local groups that are involved. And in financial education, educators want more information about climate change through the lens of the ripple effects it'll have on families. Now, educators are interested in this information in a variety of formats, including websites, printable fact sheets to share with constituents, as well as infographics. And beyond just facts and data, they want to hear case studies. What are other Wisconsin communities doing to address these issues? What successes have they had? So I'll wrap up now with some implications of my research for future research and practice. The overarching takeaway for me is that there are a couple problems when we think about communicating about climate change in these more rural and conservative communities. The first is that the term itself can be politically polarizing, but that polarization can be overcome if we approach the topic a different way. The other potential problem is that as an umbrella concept, climate change can be too broad for a lot of the day-to-day issues that people are experiencing on the ground. So what that means for future research on the quantitative side of things, we need to avoid just using the phrases climate change and global warming in the research stimuli that we're showing to people. We need to also be using the actual discourse of the community that we're trying to study. And then educators talked in very context-dependent ways about how they frame climate-related issues. So we really can't draw any sweeping conclusions about the relative effectiveness of emphasis frames. We can't say an economic frame is always most effective or a public health frame is always most effective, because it really depends on the locally specific examples. And so we need to be incorporating those into research as well, again, to just better reflect how people are talking about these issues on the ground. On the qualitative side of things, I see a need for more local case studies, both in other extension program areas like 4-H, natural resources, dairy and livestock, as well as just other community groups who are addressing climate change at a local level. And extension can be a really valuable partner for that research because of its deep-rooted, long-standing, trusted networks and relationships on the ground. So some ideas for how Wisconsin Extension can address climate change moving forward. I'm thinking of this in terms of 3 constituent categories. First, you have the group that are completely opposed to the phrase climate change. And although these folks are quite vocal, they're probably the smallest group that we have to consider. And with them, it does make sense to just completely avoid the term and talk about it in other ways. The next group, probably much larger, is those who acknowledge the climate is changing but don't prioritize it in their day-to-day lives. And with them, going in the back door can be really powerful, where you really focus on those day-to-day issues that matter to them, and maybe bring in climate change as a secondary aspect of the messaging, but not a central focus. And then the last group is those who actively want to address climate change. And Extension does have constituents in this category, especially in Dane County. And with them, we do need to be direct and straightforward about it. That's just the most effective way to meet the needs that constituents are expressing. Another need that I heard when I asked about uncertainties and challenges, educators told me that they want more professional development, both on climate science and impacts, as well as climate change communication. And again, this needs to be tailored to specific program areas so that it's immediately actionable for people. And all of this can come together in an organization-wide strategy involving both climate-focused and non-climate-focused programming so that we're effectively addressing adaptation and mitigation across the state. And that's going to require not just permission from Extension Administration, but also really active support and an active providing of resources and staffing. So to tie this all together, I'll just close with a quote from a financial education educator. This is what they said when I asked about their vision for the path forward for climate change and extension. First, there's learning about what is climate change, right? What does climate change mean for Wisconsin? And then breaking it down to what does climate change mean to the folks that I work with, to my county? And then how do I get that word out? And how do I start incorporating those pieces into the programming that I already do? So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer your questions and chat more about the projects.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, so I'll open up the floor to anyone in here, in the room, or on Zoom. I don't know if you want to, I got a lot of clapping.
There we go.
And yeah, Scott, I'll let you
Okay.
have a question.
Yeah, anyone on Zoom, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or anyone in here as well.
Scott, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is great, fascinating. I mean, we've talked about this before. I just really appreciate your research, and it's going to mean so much for extension climate programming and outreach as we go forward if these recommendations that you found and this research that you've done can be applied. So thank you so much for this. It's been very, very well done. I'm curious. I know that you interviewed extension educators that were from a variety of different urban and rural areas.
Yeah.
A variety of years of experience in extension. Did you do any kind of crosstab between years of experience in extension and an educator's ability, interest to talk about climate change with their constituents? The reason why I'm asking this question, not to put you on the spot, but I know that we have a lot more newer extension educators that may, I'm just curious if this is a difficulty with the issue of climate change, which I suspect it is, or are we also looking at a difficulty in other issue-based programming that requires application of research to a local situation?
Yeah. I didn't formally analyze that, but just running through the list in my head, I didn't see a clear trend in anything related to age. I mean, in crops and soils, there was the younger educators, the ones who were newer with extension, did seem to be the ones who were talking about it more with constituents, but I only interviewed 4 crops and soils educators, so I can't really say anything conclusive about that. But looking across my whole pool of interviewees, there were some who were on the younger side or newer with extension who weren't talking about it as much, and there were some who've been here longer and were talking about it quite a lot, so I don't think there was a clear trend there.
Thank you. I'm just curious if it's a systemic issue of educators not having the tools or experience to apply research locally, or as it came out, or if this is really particular to this wicked issue of climate change, which I suspect it might be a little bit of both, especially towards the climate change issue. But thank you.
Mm-hmm. Diane, do you have one?
First, I really liked it. I thought you summed up in an amazingly short amount of time a huge amount of stuff that I've observed. My question for you, and you can say, I don't want to answer that, is the thing I'm grappling with, right? The reality, I think your recommendations are completely in line with what I would say and what my colleagues are saying of, with people who are totally resistant, certainly don't use the word climate change, be very subtle about it, only use that term with people who are, but my question is, if we're gonna start talking about mitigation, and I strongly believe we have to bring that into our programming, are we falling into the trap of undermining ourselves by seeing it as a taboo term, by not talking about it? The idea, and I don't know what the proper term is, that you normalize something by talking about it, even a thing that people totally wouldn't accept at first. And so, by making it taboo, do we feed into that? So any thoughts you have would be super welcome.
I've been thinking about that a lot, especially the past few days, because I had a conversation with someone part of the National Extension Climate Initiative, who was raising that same concern. And I think that is definitely something that we have to be actively thinking about. my thoughts right now on that, as it comes to like mitigation, is that there are so many co-benefits to most mitigation practices. There are benefits to the people doing those practices, whether that's farming practices that are going to help with soil health and water quality and, you know, reduce the amount of fertilizer you have to put on, that sort of thing. But also like other mitigation practices like installing solar panels has economic benefits. So I think really in the short term, leaning into those immediate benefits to people is probably the way to start. But I think in the long term, we do eventually need to be addressing it more directly. I think it's a matter of how do we get there without turning a bunch of people off from the start. Like how do we bring them along with us and like gradually get them more on board with it? I think it's going to be a long process, not something we can do immediately. What do you think about that?
I'm confused as well, right?
Okay.
Part of me thinks, yes, that's the way to go, it's the safe way to go. Part of me certainly doesn't want to put any local educator in the position of, you know, turning off their constituents.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if we can have a sort of a good cop, bad cop, right? You know, and use the research community here in Madison, which one educator was kind of doing.
I think that's a good example of that.
To have that not be not talked about, but have maybe a degree of separation.
Yeah. Where the local educator is like more aligned with the constituents, and then maybe the specialists or other parts of extension.
Or at least superficially, the local
right,
educator
superficially.
says,
Yeah.
you know, there's been conversation about extreme weather or whatever. It's I'm going to bring in this, you know, researcher from Madison, and you know, and creates that sort of safe distance, whatever the local educator actually believes.
Right.
I think just to not just make the word taboo, as I said, or the term concept taboo.
Cool, and then I see Lisa had a hand raised as well.
Yeah, hi, great presentation, Scott. You interviewed me and I was really excited to talk to you, and our conversation made me think even deeper about this whole issue. And just as a response to that last question, I'm a community development educator in Ashland County, the far northern part of the state, 14,000 people, highly rural, communities of 500 are pretty much the norm. And I'm one of those people who talks about extreme weather. Climate change does not really ring anybody's bell, but every single person in my county has been negatively impacted by all kinds of extreme weather, and they're more than happy to talk about that. I rarely bring up the term mitigations in my rural communities. It just goes right past people. It's like a university word. So I say reduce the impacts. And that is an introductory phrase, but also it allows me to say things like, we're not going to completely get rid of all of these things that are being caused by extreme weather. Some things we're not going to be addressed, but we're trying to reduce the impacts of what's happening.
Yeah.
And that floats really well. Instead of the whole argument, you know, if I talk about mitigation, does that negate the importance of climate change? I just sidestep that whole thing and say, look, your community's lost a bunch of roads, you lost a lot of building roofs from heavy snowfall, you had a polar vortex that stopped business cold for weeks. How do we reduce those impacts? And everybody gets on board on that. My quick question is, I think you had said you found in research that people, their first is for outreach or educational materials about climate change comes from extension.
Oh yeah, that was that was a survey of Midwest agricultural advisors in I think 2012, and they were asked of all these different information sources, who do you trust and like to what extent.
Okay.
And extension
Well,
came
that's
out
great
on
to
top.
know.
Yeah.
Because I also try to bring in other rural or ag resources like USDA and NRCS. And NRCS and our land and water conservation districts in our counties are really talking a lot about climate change for ag operators. They're openly talking about how do we reduce the impacts from climate change on our farmland and operations. So I just wondered, I wanted to clarify what what you had said about extension, and then just say that those other two national agencies are much more strongly worded about climate change and mitigations.
Okay, that's
So
interesting.
great research. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, there was someone else who has their hand raised. Kat?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lisa, that was great insights. I too am in northern Wisconsin and our communities here in Iron County, so although I work kind of as a state specialist, so I do programming directly in climate change. And as we know from climate communications research, that it's been shifting how many people nationwide and in Wisconsin believe that global warming is happening. It's like 70%, it's increasing. Whether or not it affects people themselves, that's a little bit less. That's why it's so important about what you said, Scott. We have to message what people value, and local messaging is so important. But then we find out that we take a look at how many people actually speak about or communicate about climate change even a couple times a week, and we're down in the 20%.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, we can be the messengers, we can help, but I'd like to get your thought. In fact, you even said extension is a message source, and I'm not sure what that means in your research. So that's one thing I'd like you to clarify. But secondly, what are your thoughts about us extension educators helping people become climate communicators themselves? Maybe not in such a term like that, but I try to teach people how to communicate about climate change, because it's such a huge problem. A lot of people get vapor locked and what to do, but we all have a mouth and we can all communicate to our peers about this. And sometimes that's the strongest source of communication, is when someone who is your peer is talking with you about it. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that has the potential to be really powerful. And in fact, I know California Extension has developed a climate stewards program that functions similarly to a Master Gardener or Master Naturalist program, where there's a training that you go through, then you have a certification, and it's supposed to do exactly what you're describing, empower you to go out and have conversations with other people in your community who are your peers. And Illinois was inspired by that and has been adapting it, and I think this summer they are going to launch, Illinois Extension is going to launch a climate stewards program as well. So yes, I think that sort of thing is really powerful, and we should be looking to do that sort of thing in as many places as possible. And then as to your question about a message source, that basically just means, like, if you're talking with someone, with someone from Extension or a scientist or crop advisor or whoever else, how much do you trust them? Whether that's like verbal communication or like you're on their website and the DNR website or the Extension website, that so kind of covers all those forms of communication, just like who is providing the information.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else here in the room?
I'm a University of Illinois graduate, so I'm bragging about the Climate Stewards program and just put a link in the chat.
Cool, thank you. Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to dominate this with questions, because this really strikes home to my interests and my professional focus. So I'm thinking about the climate leadership team and Extension starting kind of on the path of getting a climate program together finally. Mm-hmm. What would be this two-part question again? Climate leadership team right now is kind of building that foundation, going through the strategic planning that we're doing, or restructuring.
Yeah.
What are some things, given your research, that could make, we've talked about like the climate communication professional development. We actually have that on the docket to get something like that together for professional development. But before we get this extension program going, regular, what could the climate leadership team do based on your research to be more effective in helping our Extension colleagues communicate better about climate change? What could we do now, and then kind of help prepare Extension as it's getting its own program kind of together?
Yeah, I think some of the types of resources that I heard educators expressing an interest in are resources that do already exist. So I think, as it takes time to get some actual formal training together, there are written resources, web resources on climate change communication that we could share with people who we know are interested. There are a couple that I cite in in my thesis, like the one that I know you have used from Columbia, the 2009 one, that has a lot of great advice in it. And, you know, sharing kind of like Catherine Hayhoe's TED Talk, there's existing resources that I think a lot of people just don't know about yet. And in terms of like science of climate change, again, there are existing resources that we can share with people who just want to learn more about the background of the science. So I think those are a couple main things. And then I think just making it clear, because it's kind of already this way, where the climate leadership team has specific people who are listed on the website as kind of the go-to person for energy and different topics, like energy and climate, energy and climate, farming and climate, you know, that. But if we make that clearer and maybe try to like share that more actively with the different program areas, that like, hey, if you have a question about climate change, here's someone in particular you can come and ask that question to. That might help as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Ashley.
I recall that you spoke a little bit about understanding better local needs, and sort of tailoring communication efforts to those local needs. How are we identifying local needs, or how do you envision us becoming more clear on what these local needs are? Is this up to Extension? Is there some other entity that should be playing a role here?
I think Extension definitely does have a role to play there. A lot of educators are interacting day in and day out with their communities, and so they have that on the ground sense of what the communities need. But I think more formal like surveys and stuff could help as well. I think really it's just a mix of like understanding from all different perspectives and making those connections with local community interest groups as well.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think with that, Kat, if we're gonna close this session to just me, you, Brett, and Scott, and we can ask a couple more detailed questions about the thesis, but we'll end the open session. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you everyone on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you.